Well, my name's David Menton. My background is a human anatomist. So I guess that qualifies me to talk a bit about the human body today. And the whole issue is God didn't make any ape-men. And then we turn right around after we say God didn't make any ape-men. And we say 3 ways to make an ape-man. Kind of sounds like we're a little confused already up here, doesn't it? Well, I believe both statements are true. God didn't make any ape-men, and for that we'd have to look at Scripture. And what about 3 ways to make an ape-man? Well, you've heard of ape-man. I guess that's why you're here. Humans make ape-men in their mind. They conjure them up. And really the whole burden of what we'll be talking about this afternoon is there's 3 ways to do this. And if anyone can think of a 4th way after the lecture's over, come on by and let me know and I'll add it to the lecture. Okay, well, let's dig in. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, so why don't we just begin there too? Psalm 100, one of the great creation psalms, has this to say: "Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who has made us and not we ourselves." We're not self-made men, as people sometimes say. We are His people, and this is the implication of all that. Since He's created us, we haven't created ourselves. Therefore, we are His people and the sheep of His pasture. That's from, of course, the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Here, the Lord is going to quote the Old Testament. That was the Bible that was available, right, in His time and the time of Jesus Christ. And He quotes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, to illustrate a point. He responded to a group of people, said to them, "Have you not read? He who made them in the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason.'" Have you thought about that before? God making us male and female has a reason, and God says, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." I'm going to make a prediction here. If we ever get to a point in our society where we don't accept what is said here, that marriage is a man and woman joined for life, that we were made in God's image from the beginning. If we get to the point where we miss that, we won't know what marriage is anymore. Wait a minute, we're there. We're already there. Well, evolutionists have a very different view, of course, of the origin of man. This is a very famous evolutionist, comes from that Huxley family that were great champions of Charles Darwin. And this is Julian Huxley from a lecture he gave at the University of Chicago several years ago when they had a big meeting celebrating Darwin's, 200th birthday at the time. He said, "In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural." He said, "The earth was not created, it evolved." Now get this. "So did all of the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, our mind and soul, as well as brain and body, and so did religion." Have you thought about that? Religion itself, according to evolution, would have had to evolve. Everything that's real has to evolve. And so far from God explaining how man came to be, man will now, through evolution, explain how we came to come up with God. I've come to the conclusion that evolution can be considered a jealous God that will have no other gods before it. That is, nothing can be held above it as being higher than God. Evolution purports to explain God Himself. Well, let's look at what's the basic argument for human evolution. First of all, what's the pattern? What is supposed to have happened? This chart presumes to go back about 5 million years ago. Here, this 5 represents 5 million years. And according to evolutionists, at about that time, other people pick a different time, but about the 5 million point, there was a split here in this creature right here that's called an ape-like creature. They never call it an ape, they always call it an ape-like creature. If they called it an ape, they would be showing that over 5 million years, apes evolved into what? Apes. That's why they avoid calling that ancestor that's supposed to be a common ancestor of humans and apes, an ape-like creature. Well, I happen to believe that apes came from ape-like creatures. I think chickens came from chicken-like creatures too, don't you think? The problem is this other one, and by the way, notice they don't waste much time and effort producing intermediates here. I could put in Australopithecus or a few things like that, but basically nothing much happens from here to here. You're going from an ape to an ape. It's this direction that gets all the interest. And that's why when an evolutionist finds a primate in the fossil record, there's much more impetus to call it an ancestor of humans than to just make it a dead ape or ancestor of apes. Here's it's not meant to be exhaustive here, just some of the major points we read about and hear about. The first one out of the chute here that we're identifying is Ardipithecus ramidus. Some would just call it Australopithecus ramidus. We'll talk about that in a bit. Then there's Australopithecus anamensis. You notice we're going to have a lot of creatures now with A in front of their name. That stands for Australopithecus, which translates southern ape. Australo, like Australia, pithecus meaning an ape. So this is Australopithecus anamensis, supposed to be somewhere between ramidus and this next famous one up here. This one you've all heard of. That's Lucy. You've heard of Lucy, haven't you? Lucy is a name given to one specimen of this particular creature, and the scientific name is Australopithecus afarensis. Now we get a fork in the road, and one branch goes over here, and the other branch goes over here. In this particular drawing, not every evolutionist would agree with this. What you're looking at there is Australopithecus africanus, not to be confused with afarensis. Some people say it sort of became extinct. We call that a collateral relative that didn't make it. Evolutionists call it that. Others would put africanus down here on this route going from Lucy up to a relatively recent discovery, and that's Australopithecus sediba. And I'll be talking about that and Lucy at some length. Then about 2 million years ago, we get our genus Homo. How many genera of Homo do we have today? One. Homo means ourself, basically. So there's just one. How many species of human beings or Homo do we have alive today? Just one, Homo sapiens. Sapiens means smart cookie, or wise. You can see who named us, so we named ourselves. And then now we're getting the really delicate stuff here that you very hard to see the difference. There's what's called subspecies or incipient species. How many subspecies of humans do we have today? You were on a good roll there. You can hold up one finger again. Yeah, it'd be one. Or Homo sapiens, subspecies sapiens. In other words, if you didn't think we were smart the first time, we repeat it. Now let's get down to a really narrow area, and that is how many races? That's even below subspecies yet. Subspecies interbreed, species can interbreed. Now we're down to race. And after the Human Genome Project, you may have heard about, where they sequenced the genes of humans, there have been several people groups who have been sequenced. The scientists have come to the conclusion that there's only one race. There's not enough difference among us to really classify us in different races. So I guess you could just say what? The human race. That's pretty much it. We're all brothers and sisters ultimately. Well, let's get into the science of the lecture. I'll try to make it educational as well as boring. What's the difference between an ape and a human? The skull is the most interesting thing to look at. Wouldn't you agree the skull is more interesting here than, say, the toe bone? By the way, this is a new weight loss program we're promoting here at the museum. No, that's Yorick. He'll help us out from time to time. What's the difference between an ape and a human if we start looking at the skull? Look at other parts. I have a list for you here. We can just go right down the list. And I'll illustrate it with some skulls. These are made out of resin or plastic, so they're not real skulls, but they look real. They're pretty expensive, too. They're a replica. This is human. And the first difference between apes and humans we could point out are the nose bones, the nasal bones right here. If you break your nose, that's what you break. You break the nasal bones, okay? And we have two of them. You can see the seam in the middle if you look close. And they're like a little awning that hang out at the front of our face here. And apes don't have protruding nasal bones. Let's take a look at this. This is a chimp here. This is supposed to be the most similar to humans of living primates. You've all probably seen a chimpanzee. And it has nasal bones right here, but they're flat. So next time you're at the zoo, you might want to do an experiment. Go up to the biggest, meanest looking silverback gorilla you can find, get a hold of his schnoz. You can push it all over his face because it's all soft tissue, no bone in it. Now, they get testy, so I don't recommend doing this, actually. Here's another, I'm sorry, we got these backwards. This is, this is an orangutan. This is the chimp. I normally have them set up, but we got them backwards this time. So this is the chimp here. But once again, just like the orangutan you just saw, flattened nasal bones, okay? And there's another feature that's so tiny you're going to think I'm picky just to even mention it. But if you do a little experiment, put your finger like a mustache under your nose and go up, you will hit a little bony spur sticking out. A little piece of bone. I'll show you that piece if the cameras can get in really close here now. It's this little point. Can you see it on screen at all? If they haven't been able to put a sunscreen, have they? This little point here is what we call the nasal spine. If we look at apes, they do not have a nasal spine at all. And there's a good reason for that. You might ask, what is the nasal spine doing? Is it just there so we can make mustache once in a while? No, you see, the nasal spine is a ledge on which our nasal septum, which divides our nasal cavity into two halves. In humans, because our face is flat, a bit of the nasal septum actually protrudes from the nasal cavity, and it sits on top of the spine. You can see a little groove in there where it sits in that groove. Apes have a sloped face, okay? Apes have a sloped face. Can you all notice that? Okay, this isn't too subtle, is it here? People say, yeah, but what if you hold it like that? Then it would be a vertical face. You go by the cheekbones, okay? When the cheekbones here, called a zygomatic arch, when that's parallel to the table or the floor, that's about the way the skull would have set on the head of the ape. And notice the slope. If you run a line out the cheekbone that's the kind of slope we're talking about. Not very subtle, is it? Pretty obvious. You take a human skull, you do the same thing. We have a cheekbone too, it's called homology. Same basic bone, same name, serve similar function. That would be parallel to the ground on a human too, and if you run it out to the plane of the face, essentially perpendicular. So those are some differences right off the bat. The slope of the face, the presence of the protruding nasal bones for a human, the lack of a nasal spine in apes, but it's present in humans. If we look at our orangutan over here, the same thing is true. No nasal spine in there. The reason apes don't have it is because their face is sloped and the nasal septum is recessed further inside the skull. With a vertical face, the nasal bone protrudes a little bit. So there's really a reason behind all of these things that I'm showing you. What else can we say? The shape of the forehead. Humans have a curved forehead right here. This is curved, okay? You might want to do a little experiment, right, on your own body. You put your hand up here on your forehead, get the shape, and then when you take it away, look at it. Now, if you take your hand away and it looks like this, we need to talk right after the lecture, okay? Come by. You ought to have a curvature like this, just like this model of a human skull does. What about apes? The upper part of their face is flat. You can see it here, and you can see it in the orangutan here. Okay? That leads to yet another trait that is distinctive between humans and apes. Think of two ice cream cones with the big end facing you. Okay, no ice cream in this talk, just the cones. They would be two circles. just like this. Imagine now if you cut to make a curved forehead. Remember the curved forehead we talked about? If you made a cut across those cones, they would become oval, and they would be cut back on the side. That's exactly what we see in a human. Instead of looking goggle-eyed with a nice big, tall, round, goggle-shaped orbit, it's more oval. And that's because it's been cut. Basically, think of it as being cut in a curved forehead here. What that does is it exposes the side. If you look at the side of the skull, you can look right into the orbit, at the medial bones of the orbit here from the side. If you try this with our friend the orangutan here, you don't get much view of the orbits from the side. So that's a collection of things. I think we've hit everything. Oh, I added one just recently. We've been talking about this cheekbone, right? The zygomatic arch. And I mentioned that humans have it. We do indeed, it's right here. And apes have it, like this chimp here. What do we have that for? That is a kind of protection of a muscle that comes down here. The muscle's attached to the skull, and we call this the temporal part of the skull. It attaches there. You can even see a line on this chimp where the muscle attached. And then that muscle goes down through that hole to the mandible here, to a process on the mandible. And that's a muscle of chewing. When that muscle contracts, it bites, okay? In fact, I've just been bitten, I think. There we go. So look at how big the muscle is on this chimp. It's this whole area. I can get 3 fingers comfortably in there, and almost a fourth. Okay, this human would have been much bigger than that chimp in body size. But look at the size of the space where this temporalis muscle passes through. It's very tiny here. And we still have a temporalis muscle, just like other creatures do. It attaches to the temple, goes down through there, but it's much smaller. You've heard of Lucy. We already mentioned her. And people may have told you, well, she's almost human, or she's on her way to becoming human. Let's just look at the zygomatic arch, something you never worried about before, but now when you look at an ape-man, you're going to be looking for the zygomatic arch. Right? If you look at that, I'll tell you, you get bit by a creature like Lucy, you're going to stay bit. That's just massive. I can get 4 fingers through this. And how tall was Lucy? 3 feet 7 inches tall, with chewing muscles this size that I don't think any human being has ever existed with, the temporalis muscles being that thick. So that's kind of well, here's another little trick you can look for in an ape. We call this a dental arcade. Humans have an arch like the St. Louis arch. We look at this human from the bottom. Does that remind you of St. Louis Arch, if you've been to St. Louis? And apes have a U-shaped arch. Now, there are humans that are more U-shaped than others, and there are apes that might have a slight width. But when you put all these things together that we've been talking about, believe me, you can pick out the apes from the humans. In fact, let's just do that. Let's look at a group of genuine ape-men. I mentioned Australopithecus sediba. Remember, that was the recent one that was found that is supposed to be very close to Homo? And on the left is Australopithecus sediba, and on the right is a human. Let's just apply the things we just learned. What about protruding nasal bones? Does Australopithecus sediba come through for us there? I don't think so, compared to the human. By the way, people say that Australopithecines have protruding nasal bones. Here's Lucy. What they're talking about is a little burr here, where the 2 nasal bones come together, just a little ridge. It is no protruding bone at all, but if your mind is biased towards making an ape into a monkey, then you make a big deal out of that ridge. Well, let's look at another feature of the skull. What about the slope of the face? You're looking at sediba on the left, human on the right. I think you can see the obvious slope on the face of sediba. So that would be a trait that would certainly be considered very ape-like. What about the visibility of the orbits as viewed from the side? Can you look right in? Here again, it's much easier to see into the orbit of the curved forehead of the human, whereas Lucy's forehead, and this is not really so much a replica as a kind of a reconstruction of fossils that have been found called Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy for short. Flat forehead like any proper ape, round orbits like any proper ape, no protruding nasal bone, no nasal spine, U-shaped, big zygomatic arch here. But notice the orbits of the eye are round, goggle-eyed. And from the side, you can hardly see into them because the forehead's flat. You sort of getting the hang of this? You think you're a little better prepared to go into a museum that purports to show human evolution and find your way through? What about the cranial capacity? Maybe Australopithecus sediba comes through there. And the cranial capacity for sediba is 400 cc's. That is, if you were to take the skull and you got this hole called the foramen magnum, and you were to pour, say, millet seed in there, and then dump it out into a graduated cylinder, you could see how many cc's fit to give you the capacity. The old idea was big brains are smart and little brains aren't so smart, so they made a big deal out of brain size among human beings. Turns out the cranial capacity of a human being ranges, the normal range is from about 700 cc's at the small end up to about 2 liter at the large end, and for a human male, about 1.4 or 1.5 liters. And there's no correlation between intelligence and body size. None. How do we know that for sure? Because women, on average, have a little bit smaller cranial capacity than men. And they're not less intelligent by any means, but their bodies, on average, are a little smaller. And so their cranial capacity normally will run with weight or size. The bigger the brain, with no correlation to intelligence. What about apes? They have about the same range of variability in size, from about 300 up to 500 cc's for an ape. And again, it correlates with the size of the ape, with a gorilla having a really big brain compared to a chimp. But overall, we can say that the cranial capacity of a human is about 3 times the size of the average ape. But it's the way the brain's put together that makes the big difference between humans and apes. Our ability for abstract thought and anticipating the future and what have you, and discussing the beauty of something. Obviously, no animal has done anything remotely like that. So there again, I would say it's an ape, and overall, what would the conclusion be? Well, based on the skull, I'd say an ape. One of the most important pieces of evidence we could look for would be cultural artifacts. Apes just don't make tools and use them then to make other tools. This is a feature of humans, and wherever you find proper human skeletons or fossils, usually sooner or later you'll find evidence of human habitation or hunting or cooking or artwork, what have you. We'll talk about that when we have a few specific examples. So I would say overall, Australopithecus sediba strikes me as being an ape and not related in any necessary way to humans. Remember when I showed you the chart at the very beginning was Ardipithecus remitis? It was one of the first ones that separated, presumably, from those creatures that became apes. Take one look at the orbits of the eye there. What would you say we're looking at? Those shapes of those orbits are just screaming ape. The nose bones are flat. It's hard to see that when you're looking from the front. There is no nasal spine. But look at the width of the skull here. Right here, see here? And look at the width of the cheekbones. If we were put together in that proportion, I would have cheekbones out here someplace. And I'd have a massive zygomatic arch through which a huge temporalis muscle ran. So you see how powerful these little things are when you're looking for details? At least you can critically evaluate. And the cranial capacity of Ardipithecus remitis was 300 cc's, which puts it at the small end of apes. So I would conclude that Ardipithecus is an ape. What about Australopithecus africanus? We mentioned that. That was in the side chute. Some people believe it became extinct and went no further. Others believe no, it went on up to Australopithecus sediba. This is a juvenile. It happened that the first Australopithecine found was a juvenile. And I have a replica of a chimp skull in my office, and I have a replica of this fossil of Australopithecus africanus, and it's very difficult to tell a true part. They love to show this because the cranial size, look at the size of the brain relative to the face, that's quite large, but that's typical of the juveniles in primates in general. That the brain is larger at first because it develops early. Even in the embryo as we're growing and into the fetus, the brain's very precocious and grows very quickly. And the spinal cord, part of the central nervous system, grows very quickly. The rest of the body kind of catches up later. I guess it's because those particular features are needed earlier in development. In any event, if you apply all the criteria we've talked about, I think we've got another ape on our hands here. Now let's get to a creature they actually call a man, or a human. Nutcracker man. Have you heard of Nutcracker man? He goes by a lot of different names. Most popular one today is probably the one given, Paranthropus boisei. Others called it Australopithecus boisei, and some call it Australopithecus, implying that it's very large, or gargantuan Australopithecus. Now, first of all, look at the top of the skull. You see this ridge here? You look at a male gorilla, you see the same thing. It's called a sagittal crest. It's right on top of the head here. And what's that for? A weather vane or something when the creature's walking? No, the temporalis muscle is so huge on this creature, while the skull is so small, there's not enough room on the skull to attach the temporalis muscle. So you have to have a big ridge on the top here. You can see a hint of it here, two little lines. That's where the temporalis muscle come together. But at some point, you have to have a plate up here. So if you were to tap a gorilla on the skull, any place off the center line, you'd be tapping an inch or two of muscle between your finger and the skull, all related to chewing. So talk about bite, they have that ability. And I guess that's why they called this creature Nutcracker Man, because they figured, boy, he'd really be good at cracking nuts. Today, they're not even sure he ate nuts or anything else. Notice the zygomatic arch is huge, which you'd expect here. The face is very sloped, no protruding nasal bones, and no nasal spine. Goggle-eyed, see the round goggle eyes. Again, an ape. What about this one? Have you heard of him? Cro-Magnon man. Now, you can't just trust the word man when they throw it in, like they did with Nutcracker man. I think it was an ape, as I understand anatomy. But what about Cro-Magnon man? We might begin by how big a cranial capacity? About 200 cc's more than most modern humans do have. So he's no lightweight when it comes to brain size. Look at the orbits of the eye. Are they round goggle eyes or are they more oval? It's really the more oval appearance, isn't it, right in here? And look at the nasal bones, how nicely they protrude. And the face is pretty much perpendicular to the zygomatic arch, which would be right in this area. It's broken, but it was right in here. Everything put together, curvature of the forehead, no question human, but for me, the real clincher comes from cultural evidence. We have loads of cultural evidence for Cro-Magnon man, tools and things of that nature. So, unquestionably human. You see, you can tell a difference. I'm not suggesting that there weren't humans who maybe even at the time of the flood particularly, who had very poor nutrition. We certainly see evidence of that in human fossils we find. Bones that were broken and rather massive bones to resist forces put on them. So you may find some skulls that are difficult to call. but then there are other things in the body to look at too. By and large, it's pretty easy to separate the apes from the humans. So what are the 3 ways to make an ape-man? Here you go, the whole purpose of the visit. First of all, you can combine fossils from apes and from humans, the 2 separate, okay, ape and human, put them together, call it one individual, and you have an ape-man. Now that could be done intentionally, of course, somebody who had a devious intent. Could very easily be done inadvertently because these fossils are usually scattered about and you're picking up pieces here and there. Lucy was picked up in 2 different years, picked up parts to put together what became Lucy. And you can't tell in every case whether you've got more than one individual or only one, unless you get 2 bones that are, she should only have 1. You get 2 left arm bones up here, that would suggest 2 individuals. Now, another way to make an ape-man is to find humans in the fossil record. They're very rare, but try to find something about them that you can say is ape-like, okay? And so there you're taking a human demoting to an ape level. And this is the most common of all. You find apes in the fossil record and you try to upscale them to say there's this or that feature that allows them to be promoted to being closer to humans or human. Let's look at all 3. Combining men and apes, that was done with Piltdown man. That was a model that was widely sold. I had a faculty colleague at Washington University School of Medicine that had one of these on her desk. So I think she was well aware, as we are today, that Piltdown man was a hoax. We're not sure who did it. Everybody's got some ideas. There have been several books written on Piltdown man. It gets its name from having been found in a quarry in Piltdown, England, not far really from Darwin's home. This was back in 1912 near Sussex, England, or in Sussex. I spoke at Sussex University some years ago. It's the only time I've had my life threatened while on the stage. They don't take too kindly to having Darwin critiqued at Sussex. They dated this Piltdown man and were pretty confident that it would come out at 300,000 years. And anyone, of course, who would disagree with that would be dismissed as a science denier. So you got that figure in mind, 300,000 years? It turned out that the skull was, in fact, a human skull, one with a very large cranial capacity. And it was a modern skull, but by modern, we don't mean 2020 or something like that. We're talking about a skull from probably the 13 or 1400s when the plagues went through Europe and wiped out, some say, over half the population. We're kind of familiar with plagues these days, aren't we? I used to give this lecture a few years ago and nobody thought too much about them. Now with COVID, we do think about it. There were so many people who had died, there was no place to bury them. So they put people, bodies into caves and into culverts and quarries and any place they could find to put them. It's believed that the skull was that source. And then the mandible, the jawbone here, was from a very modern orangutan. And it had some molars that came with it that were part of it. And then it had a chimp canine tooth. So this was quite a collection. We had a human skull, orangutan molar, and chimp canine tooth. And guess what? I've got the whole gang here for you today to show you who was put together to make. First of all, here is a conception of what the skull might have looked like. But notice the things that were found are what's in brown or black here. So this and, oh, look, the nasal bones. Isn't that perfect? They found the nasal bones and they're protruding. So the size of this skull, you have to kind of project the angle as you go across to get an idea of size. The size of this skull, the base of the zygomatic arch here, all of this is completely compatible with human. The nasal bones are just spot on. Somebody said, boy, if we could just find the canine teeth from this individual, that would help. And wouldn't you know it, within a month or so, there they found the canine tooth. In the Piltdown quarry, here is the mandible that presumably was supposed to be from Piltdown man, but as it turned out, it was from an orangutan, a female orangutan, and I just happen to have a female orangutan with me here. So this mandible here was used to make the mandible we see down there. There's a lot about this mandible that suggests it's not human. The broadness of this element right here is one. The thickness is another. Notice they knocked off the end that articulated with the skull because that would have shown it to be not related to the skull. So modern orangutan mandible with molars, some molars. And the tooth here came from a chimp. We have a chimp, it would be this tooth down here. Now, anyone looking at this tooth would never think human for a minute. So whoever perpetrated the hoax filed the tooth down. And when they filed it down, they filed into the pulp chamber. Bummer, now you got a hole going right into the tooth. Whoever perpetrated the hoax took some kind of cement, pushed it in the hole, smoothed it off, hoping that nobody would pay any attention, and for many years, nobody did. I mean, I would have thought anyone looking at this silly tooth filled with a matrix would only come to one of two conclusions. One, this is a hoax, or two, this is the world's first root canal. I mean, that's basically your choices there. So we're not fighting over this anymore, creationists and evolutionists. Everybody agrees this was a hoax. And wow, it fooled people for a long time. Not everybody, even not every evolutionist was taken in by it. But as you see from the notes on the screen up there, this was a successful hoax for about 40 years. There were PhD theses written on this creature and all kinds of things. Well, I'm glad Piltdown man's out of the way, and I think there could be many other examples where parts have been mixed with human and non-human parts, whether intentional or not. What about making apes out of humans? That was done with Neanderthal man. Before we even begin, let's just look at Neanderthal man's skull. I have a replica of a Neanderthal skull. It's not a generalized Neanderthal skull, it's a specific one. This particular one didn't have a mandible. But we have lots of Neanderthal skeletons, enough that every bone in the body can be accounted for, including this little tiny bone under here called the hyoid bone. Can't see it, the jaw's in the way. So let's just apply our criteria that you learned. What about cranial capacity, first of all, compared to modern man? We're not going to do a measurement, just take a look. What would you say? Bigger, same size, or smaller? Bigger, sure, bigger. That doesn't mean he was smarter, but we're not looking at an ape brain here. That's what I really want to get across. For a big skull, what about the zygomatic arch? I can get 2 fingers, but not 3 in there. When you're taking a little skull like this one, look at the size of that arch for a much smaller creature compared to the human. See the differences, how major they are. What about the protruding nasal bones? You might say, well, wait a minute, I notice that's a light color. That would be something they didn't find for this particular skull. Well, as I say, a lot of other fossils have been found of Neanderthal had a very nice protruding nasal bone. And look at that nasal spine. Why, you just couldn't get more perfect than that. What about the slope of the face? Pretty much perpendicular to the cheekbone. The forehead is curved. And the orbits are not goggle-type orbits. They're a little broader than tall. Everything on here, except for maybe the length of the skull, kind of a bun on the back here, and these brow ridges would be just typical human. But we have modern humans that have a more elongate skull, and we certainly have modern humans that have a distinct brow ridge, like the Australian Aboriginals. So, and lots of cultural artifacts, arguably even a cosmetics kit. They found a couple of scallop shells that had been hinged with burials of Neanderthals. And by the way, they appear to have had burial customs. Bodies were in positions consistent with intentional burying. But inside these scallop shells were pigments, different pigments, some of them kind of metallic pigments. So lots of tools, artwork, you name it. But what did the evolutionists do with it? That's supposed to be Neanderthal man. Now, you run into that fellow, you might be a little scared. He's pretty frightening. Even his wife over here is kind of frightening looking. Even the kids are ugly. It was painted up to produce this more bestial looking human being. But we don't need to guess on Neanderthal. And by the way, they say they split off from humans about 700,000 years ago. Recent genetic studies have shown that they're well within the range of variability of modern humans. And many evolutionists do consider Neanderthal to just simply be Homo sapiens. By the way, show you how this becomes a game. One of the ways you can tell one skull from another is like this, is because it's printed right on the jaw here, right on the mandible. And I'll read it. Homo sapiens, ever heard of it? You think, well, it's just Homo sapiens. Subspecies, Neanderthalensis. So they put a subspecies, and ours is Homo sapiens sapiens. Today, if you buy the same skull from the same company, Samso in Germany, that same skull will read Homo neanderthalensis. So they have demoted Neanderthal to a different species. I don't think there's enough difference to even consider it a racial difference. Okay, what does the whole body look like? On the right there, you see two views of Neanderthal man. One's straight forward and one is from the side. And there's a third Neanderthal specimen over to the left here. This one is included to show, see how the knees are bent? And over here, the knees are straight. That's a subtle thing. You visit a museum, you'd never notice this. You wouldn't think twice about what's going on. But let me just give you a quick little lesson on knees of apes versus humans. Probably never thought about it a lot. When apes walk, check it out. They don't walk the way we do, even when they walk on two legs, and no ape can do more than about 30% of its walking on two legs. Mostly they want to get down and be digitigrade. Apes can't straighten their legs out, so their knees are bent like this at all time. Make this a little experiment. The rest of your visit at the museum today, walk around with your knees just slightly bent. Don't worry, people know you were in my class, so it won't be a problem. A little bent. Boy, will you get tired. You'll just be begging to straighten those legs out. That's one of the reasons apes don't walk very long on two legs. I mean, it requires a tremendous amount of effort because they can't straighten their knee. Here's a little experiment you can do too. Sit in a chair and then kick your feet out like you're going to put them on a footstool. If you're totally relaxed and you kick your feet out, your feet go from this position when they're down to pointing out. Have you noticed that? They point out a little bit. Even our footprints, don't they point out? Just a little bit, they're not parallel. It looks funny if you walk, I'll try this, with your toes straight forward, doesn't it? Our feet are just a little bit out. That sets a lock in the knee. Very quickly sets a lock. As a result, we can stand at attention for hours because our knees are locked. As soon as we bend our knee, ever have somebody while you're standing at attention sneak up behind you and clip you right behind the knee, you can go down like a ton of brick because they've unset the lock and you weren't ready. Think of it, when you're running, every time your leg straightens out for the next stride, that foot rotates outward about 5 degrees. And the turning is not at the ankle itself, but at the knee. So we have a little bit of movement right here at the knee. And so we're setting the lock, releasing the lock, setting it, releasing it as we're running. Well, our body's got so many things that are amazing. If we had a month, I couldn't even begin to exhaust things that are amazing about the human body. Here's another piece of evidence that's interesting. You've heard of these forensic experts that can take a skeleton. This is a plastic skeleton, but if it were real, they could take a skeleton like this and flesh it out and give you some idea what it looked like when it was alive. This is how they've identified murder victims and what have you. Used to be very laborious. They would sort of make clay, and they knew the temporalis fit right in this red area, so they would attach it there. It would sort of add the muscles and then put a skin over. Now it's done with computers. There was a guy named J. Menton who did the reconstruction you're seeing before you now. On the left, a close-up, and the right, more of a body shot of the same individual. Would fit in today if he were dressed the same way. His body generally is identical. There are some distinctive features. I'll point out a few. The brow ridge, but we know Australian Aboriginals have those. A little bit lower forehead than we normally would see. People have a little bit higher forehead. But again, large cranial capacity made up for in the length of the skull. Based on the face and the body, as a human anatomist, I'd say indistinguishable from Homo sapiens, and that is indeed what it is. Add that to a lot of cultural evidence, and we're pretty well home free on Neanderthal being a human. Probably lived at the time of the flood or so and got fossilized. Not very many humans got fossilized. Not many primates in general got fossilized in the flood. What about that brow ridge, though? Does that kind of bother you a bit? Let me show you another Neanderthal. We've got so many, they have boys and girls and adults, different ages. Here's, I think, a 13 or 14-year-old Neanderthal girl that was fleshed out from the skeleton. If she were sitting in here today, would I notice anything unusual? She might have run a comb through her hair or something like that. You know, I've looked at that picture, and the only thing I can see that might get a little bit of attention is the lips are a little full. But do we have lip bones so we can look at bones and decide how big the lips should be? I mean, if I were to tell you, boy, you should have seen this guy when he was alive, the lips were out here, you'd have no way of disproving it except to say that's pretty unlikely. So you really can't, they had to put something in to make her look a little different. And I might notice that deer hide dress she has there. That's kind of unusual. Okay, what about making men out of apes? Here is an ape, Australopithecus afarensis. We've already looked at the skull. All of its features, huge zygomatic arch, sloped face, flat forehead, everything. This is an ape. The hips are ape-like, and there are many other features too. So where did it come from? It was discovered by a team led by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia back in 1974. And it has been dated at 3 million years old, but there have been all kinds of dates all over the place on Lucy. I don't accept the dates at all. But remember the 3 million is going to fit into something a little later. What did this fossil consist of? As they say, it took 2 years to find all the parts. It's about a 40% complete skeleton, they say, but I've counted the bones, and I come closer to 20% than 40, but we'll go with 40. It's lacking nearly all the foot and hand bones. There are a few. The skull and the jaw are very primitive, even by ape standards. In St. Louis, I lived there for a number of years while on the faculty of Washington University School of Medicine. They had an exhibit there called the Living World exhibit. There was nothing alive in it. It was all models and what have you. And they had this, what they said was a replica or a model of Lucy. First of all, you realize, I think I've already mentioned, but Lucy was only 3 foot 7 inches tall down in here. It'd be like a small chimp. And yet, when they make models, they usually make them bigger, so it looks more like a human being. And I used to get a kick out of looking at this model and watching other people respond to it. Children would come through, and they'd say, "Oh, look, an ape man," and the teacher would say, "No, that's an ape woman." It was basically an ape head, if you look at it, on a human female body, albeit a very hairy one. What is human like? The trunk, the breast, the genitalia, the arms and hands, the legs and feet, the posture and gait. I mean, look at that pensive gaze that she has. Do you have any idea what she's doing? She's thinking. You see how an artist can work something like that in? And then look at this close-up of the skull. I'm going to give you one more feature that isn't something you're going to see in a bony fossil. The whites of the eyes. Do you see the white part of the eye up there? There are no apes that have a white sclera. All humans have some shade of white sclera. So we don't see this in the fossil record. The eyeballs aren't preserved, just the orbits. But I get a kick out of how the artists always put some nice whites in the eye, and it gives you kind of a little message. Oh my goodness, human. And then look at those hands. They're just beautiful human hands in this model. The finger bones are nice and straight, just the way ours are. The whole hand is a clearly human-like one. But research was done by a group, Sussman and Stern, in which they looked at the curvature of the fingers. We humans have straightish, not completely straight, but mostly straight fingers. And apes have highly curved fingers because they're suspensory adapted to hang on limbs, okay? So what Stern and Sussman did is they compared this finger, this finger, this finger, and this finger with the fingers of Lucy. Now, I say Lucy, there's more than one specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, so we can fill in missing bones from other specimens. The finger bones of Lucy are charted here as compared to living apes. These are living apes, the bonobo, the chimp, the gorilla, and then compared to human. And then this is Lucy down here, or an Australopithecine. The left means straight fingers, something in this area. Over here means highly curved. So as you go to the right, it's more curved. The data came out this way. Humans fell in that range where you see the little yellow bars. So curvature's in this range down here. And Lucy, or creatures like Lucy, not only have curved fingers, but for the most part, they were highly curved even compared to other living apes. So this is not a human hand the way they show it. To make matters worse, a few years later, back in 2000, Richmond and Strait discovered that Lucy had wrists that appeared to be capable of locking during knuckle-walking. That's how you can tell a knuckle-walker, not only from the knuckles itself, but the bones of the wrist can cluster together in a certain way that locks the wrist. If we tried to walk on our knuckles, we'd be down on our palms very quickly. We could walk flat on our hand, maybe, but not like this. So it requires a very specialized wrist. Lucy appeared to have that. And so here at the Creation Museum, we made a model of Lucy. Ours is 3.5 feet tall. And we don't know what the hair looked like, but we think that's a fair guess. We show a hologram showing the humerus and the radius and ulna inside the arm. But we show her as a knuckle walker. It's kind of funny. We had a bunch of pictures for a while down below here. And they were from museums all over the world that had produced models of Lucy. And everyone was different. So we just told people if they didn't like ours, pick one from the pile. They can get just about anything they want. They want really ape-like, much more human-like. It's all out there. And what about the feet? They show the feet being basically like hairy human feet. But Lucy didn't have feet like that. Going back to Stern and Sussman, the curvature of human toes falls to the left on this graph, which means relatively straighter. And the curvature of the same toes for Lucy are further to the right, and if you'll notice, highly curved, even compared to ape standards, the blue in the middle, modern ape standards. Well, it's fun to see what the popular literature does with all these evolutionary discoveries. There's a magazine called Discover, maybe you're familiar with it. Years ago, they had an issue called Hominid Walking, and it's supposed to tell us all about how humans learned to walk when they were still Australopithecines. The dark bones basically are based on the fossil itself, and the light areas are interpreted pieces. So you notice there was a piece missing out of the middle of the femur. What's interesting is the foot is absolutely human. Let's look at a higher power view of this. Notice the feet are entirely made up of imagination here. There's no brown in here. These are just fabricated feet based on just a few toes and what have you that have been found. Look at the hands. They got the hands right. It took until the year 1996 to get them right, but they got them right finally. And this is the way the Lucy skeleton would look if indeed it could walk in a bipedal manner. What about those feet? Why did they put human feet on Lucy when we know she didn't have feet like that? Well, it's all based on some footprints that are found at least 1,000 miles away in Lotoli, Tanzania. And here's a picture of the footprints on the right. It was a long trail. It was discovered in 1972 by Mary Leakey, wife of Louis Leakey, both of them being anthropologists. And it was found in Lotoli, Tanzania, which, as they say, is a long, long ways from Africa where Lucy was found. And yet they insist the creature like Lucy made these footprints. And to hammer that point home, they went down to Lotoli, Tanzania, hunted around in bone boxes of evolutionists and what have you, and found a couple of bones that they declared to be Lucy, or Australopithecus afarensis. And that's actually the type specimen for Lucy, not Lucy herself. So all kinds of efforts made to sell a story. This trail here is quite long. It is supposed to be 3.66 million years old. Remember, Lucy was 3 million. This is 366. So these dates mean nothing. I mean, they're arbitrary. Lucy's had dates all over the map. The trail is 73 feet long, and it consists of 20 larger footprints. We're not talking giant footprints. Footprints smaller than mine, but still pretty good size. Believed to be an adult. And you don't just have one footprint. You have the left-right stride, 20 of the larger footprints in a left-right stride, next to which are 27 smaller footprints. If you look carefully, you can see here's the large one, here's the left foot, and there's the right. You can see the stride is this long. Look at the children over here that are smaller. Here's the left foot, or the right foot. Here's the left foot. Notice we're pointing out at the angle, so it's got the knee lock. See how you can use this kind of information to critique things like this? I know there's a knee lock there. The toe is pointing out. And indistinguishable from modern human feet. I heard Mary Leakey give a lecture on this shortly after she found it. She gave a lecture at Washington University, and she just didn't know how to explain this at all. These were way too early to have modern human feet. She was not convinced that Lucy made footprints like this. It was some other creature not yet found that would be appropriate for 3.66 million years old, 3.66. Be pretty ape-like according to evolutionists at that point, but obviously modern type human feet. The child increased stride to keep up with the bigger individual. What's really amazing, let's blow this up a little bit, one of these feet. Here's one of the footprints. On top of each of the big footprints is an even smaller footprint. So it appears to have been two children walking with an adult. The middle, or the bigger of the two children was increasing its stride to keep up, and the other child appeared to be stepping in the footprints of the adult. And Mary was generally puzzled by this, Mary Leakey. She said she just couldn't explain it. She mentioned that children do walk in their elders' footprints, but of course she doesn't want to believe that it's a human at all. But all of the features of a human footprint are here. The big toe goes out and is in line with the rest of the foot. And then the small toes cling to the ground here. And there's a well-developed arch in this area right here, not flat feet by any means. And when we walk, the weight is distributed like this. It starts at the heel, goes on the outside of the foot, this is a right foot, and then it has a transverse arch. The weight goes over to the inner part of the foot, and we push off with our big toe. So with Lucy, we not only have human-shaped feet, we have the human stride. I believe that the fossil footprints have nothing to do with Lucy, that they're human, 100% human, probably from the time of the flood, and that nobody's ever seen a footprint of Lucy, not ever. In case you're confused, this is ape feet versus human feet. Well, there's so many things I could get into here. Let's talk about the hips. Lucy has ape hips, and what's the difference between ape hips and human hips, and why is that important? The left is the human hip bone, the whole group that we call the pelvis. You can see the bones that are underneath our belt here, the ilia. They are right here. And notice the difference between an ape on the left and a human on the right. The iliac blades of the human, instead of sticking out like this, wrap around the side. They come more than 180 degrees. They actually start to turn in. And you can see that in this model up here. These hip bones wrap around. In an ape, they would stick straight out, both sides. Why is that important? If you have ape hips, you cannot walk the way a human walks. You have to have human hips to walk the way we do. Oh, well, now we're going to have some fun. Here's a chimp, and that is what we call ape hips. These bones sticking straight out. Look at the human from a similar view, and they wrap around. Why is this important? Well, on the side, you can see the paint mark here. That represents where muscles attach. There's a spot right here where a muscle called the gluteus medius attaches. You've heard of the gluteus maximus. You're sitting on it right now. What does the gluteus medius do? It attaches right there, right where you see the red paint, or look up at the chart here, you can see it. And the muscle goes down to our thigh bone down here and attaches to a bump here called a greater trochanter. So let's put that muscle in. Notice it's fan-shaped. That's important. What does that muscle do? It abducts the leg. So it does this. But because it's fan-shaped, it can go out this way, it can go this way, or it can go to the front. What does that do for us? When we pick up our left foot to make a step, our hip ought to drop like a ton of brake. These are ball socket joints, aren't they? Which way do ball socket joints go? Any old way. When we lift our left leg, what keeps this from happening? When we lift our left leg, the right gluteus medius tightens up just enough so that we don't abduct the leg, we just keep it steady where it is. So you see, we can walk like this. We just have to remember to tighten up our gluteus medius on the opposite side we're lifting our foot. We don't have to remember that. It's all automatic. Works perfect. What about an ape? Ape has all the same bones. There it is, the hip bones. And it has a gluteus medius. And the gluteus medius attaches right there. And it goes down to this bump on the hip bone, same as us. We call it homology. But it has a completely different function. It goes down the back, not the side. That means it cannot stabilize the hip for a monkey when they lift their foot. What it does, monkey has a posture, bent knee, forward like this. It keeps the monkey from falling on its face by rocking the body back. You say, well, we've got a problem here now. How is an ape ever going to walk on two legs if it doesn't have a muscle to stabilize the hip when it lifts each foot? Easy. Just watch the next ape. They'll teach you. When they lift their left foot, they throw their weight over the right. And when they lift the right foot, they throw their weight over the left, so this is the way they walk, right? You now know where the ape walk came from and why the ape walks with an ape walk. That's why the hips are so important. What do evolutionists do about this?
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary
Lucy with the wrong
idea.
hip.
We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't.
She had the straight-out bones.
Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
So he's saying Lucy obviously had the same type of hips as we do. It's just that something broke it or distorted it. So as you'll see in the next picture, someone is proposing it was a deer stepping on it, crunched it and made it go from this to that. What you're about to see is amazing. You're going to hear this particular anthropologist say that, that the pieces fit together so well on Lucy's hip that they're impossible. And as a human anatomist, I never figured that out. How can something fit together so well it's impossible? But he's going to say that, and he then makes it so it doesn't fit together well with a drilling tool or a saw. Here it is. You're going to get the crunch. That's the deer stepping
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
Break out the Dremel tool. Parts flying
Lovejoy
across
decided
the room.
he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape.
Notice he's
He didn't
removing
want to tamper
material,
with
not
the
just
original,
cutting.
so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
And still flat. It's still flat.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Well, it's making your own data. I think I'll conclude by giving you the last word from an evolutionist, Dr. David Piltdown, who was anthropologist at Harvard University for a number of years. He reviewed a book that Richard Leakey had written in which he had questioned all of the interpretation of human and ape fossils up to his time, and said that a fossil he had found really had to change the way we thought about human evolution. It still occurred, but in a different way. And after reading this book, this was part of Piltdown's review. Perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark, that our database is too sparse, too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology, oh, this is interesting. It reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about. But that's heresy, heresy to an evolutionist. Why is this whole issue important to a creationist? First of all, we want to be true to God's word and take him just the way he speaks to us in Scripture. But it has some profound implications. If we have Adam in our past, God sets the rules, doesn't he? And our absolutes come from God. But if we have an ape in our past and we have just simply trousered apes or warmed over apes from having evolved, then man would set the rules. There would be no creator God to set the rules, and our morality would become relative. Whatever seems right in our own eyes would be what we would do. Well, there, but for the grace of God to all of us, I thank the Lord that he's brought us to a knowledge of his word and has saved us from sin, death, and the power of Satan. Thanks for your kind attention for this afternoon. Thank you.